We continue our discussion we've had over the last several weeks concerning Jesus as God with us. We began studying the I am statements of Jesus a couple of weeks ago. We looked at the absolute I am statements that he had made concerning his identity. And then last week we began with the metaphorical statements that Jesus made concerning the identity of himself. And of course, this goes back to Exodus chapter 3, when Moses is approached by God in the burning bush. And he is told to go into Egypt to deliver the people from slavery. Moses, of course, makes many excuses because he does not want to go back. He hasn't been to Egypt for 40 years. The last time he was in Egypt, he murdered a man and became wanted by Pharaoh, his perhaps his stepbrother or stepfather at this point, and grandfather rather. And so we have a interesting dialogue between God and Moses is really grasping at straws, trying to get out of it, and he says, well, who should I say sent me to them? And God said, I am. You tell them that I am sent me to you. The verse or the verb there can also be translated as I will or I will be. And so we get the idea here that God is he is in need of nothing. He's completely self-reliant. A lot of people like to think that they are completely self-reliant, and nobody on earth is self-reliant. We might have jobs, we might be independent as much as we possibly can from our families, from the nation, from the national government, or any other kind of thing, but none of us are self-reliant because we just can't produce things in and of ourselves like God can. We just can't say, let there be food on my table, and there's food. We have to work for it. We have to do things. But God doesn't have to do that. God is self-reliant. And that's what the name I am really boils down to. And so when we see Jesus saying these things, these are not just saying things like, if you think about the job you may have, or something else in your life that you fulfill. You may say, I am a father, I am a mother, I'm a brother, I'm a sister, anything in there, I'm a mechanic, what have you. That's not what Jesus is saying. There are words for that. That's not what Jesus is doing. And so we should never think that he's just metaphorically saying these things about himself. He is, without a doubt, making a claim that he is divine. And the people listening to him realize that. And so today, after last week, we looked at John chapter 6. Jesus had fed the 5,000 and he made the declaration, I am the bread of life. And what all of that entailed and what all that meant. Today, we're going to turn to John chapter 8 and verse 12. And in John chapter 8, a lot of things have been happening leading up to it. Jesus is confronted by the Pharisees about a woman who has been caught in adultery, and of course the very famous dialogue between Jesus and the people there. And they wanted to trick Jesus into saying that they should stone the woman. And they thought that if he said that, then they could then say, see, he's not as merciful as you think he is. But then again, if he doesn't say stone her, then he's breaking the law of Moses, and he's not as righteous as you think he is. So they thought they had Jesus dead to rights right here, and then, of course, Jesus, the master teacher, just simply says, you are without sin, cast the first stone at her. And he doesn't compromise with sin on either level. What they were doing was wrong because of how they were approaching it. What she was doing was wrong as well. And Jesus took care of business on all ways. And then in the verse right after that, Jesus says, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. And so that's what we want to focus on today. I am the light of the world. We think about light. Light is a very fascinating thing. If you get a chance to study it, look it up. If you have encyclopedias, we've made a lot of scientific discoveries about light over the last 100, 200 years. We continue to do so. very fascinating, but I don't want us to get into all of the nooks and crannies about light waves and things like that. I don't want to bore you with a physics lesson this morning. When we think about light, we know what light does and how light is so important for us in our world. Light gives us the ability to grow food. The sun produces light. Without that, we can't see. Everything's in darkness. Without that, we can't live. The light from the sun does so much for our world. It's 93 million miles away, and yet, because of the way God has designed the earth, we are able to take its light, and we are able to have heat, we're able to have food, and it does so many other things that we're just now figuring out because of what God has done in nature. When we turn on a light in a room, we are able to see. If we are in a dark room, as we've mentioned before, and someone just has a little tiny light, it doesn't have to be very bright. It can be a little red light on a stereo, or maybe a DVD player or a TV that's turned off. They still have the lights on the bottom sometimes. If the entire room is dark, your eyes will be drawn to that single point of light, no matter how dim it is, which tells us that no amount of darkness, as we have said before, but it still bears repeating, no amount of darkness can ever overcome a single point of light, no matter how dim it may be. Now think about that and chew on that for a little while, because that goes with a spiritual lesson as well. But today we're going to talk about different things in the Bible where it contrasts light and darkness. We're going to talk about the prophecies concerning Jesus as the light, and then we're going to talk about the invitation that Jesus has put out for you and I to be the light of the world as well. If you turn over to Genesis chapter 1 and verse 5, in fact, the entire Bible on page 1 gives us a contrast of light and darkness. Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. So, nothing but darkness. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. So there's chaos. That's what God's wanting us to see. There's no order. There's no light. And God speaks into the darkness. And He says, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. And God called the light day. And the darkness He called night. And there was evening and there was morning the first day. Even though my mom and dad, and I know many of you do as well, they live way out in the country. City lights have started to encroach upon them more since I was a boy. But even now, it's incredibly dark outside. But even as dark as it is out there in the country, where you don't have a lot of city lights, like what they call light pollution, you still look up in the night sky, and what do you see? You see the moon. You see the stars. God has created us a world where even though it gets dark at nighttime, there's still light in the heavens. Turn over to the book of Exodus and we see that God sends the plagues upon the Egyptians. And one of the plagues that He sends on the Egyptians is darkness. Now the Israelites didn't have that darkness. The sun still shone upon Goshen where they were. But God prevented the sun from shining on the Egyptians. And it was so dark that they couldn't even see their hand in front of their face. We can still produce something like that today, but probably not completely. If you get into a room with no windows and you turn off all the lights, you can probably make it to the point where for at least a couple of minutes until your eyes adjust, you won't be able to see your hand if you put it in front of your face. That's complete and utter darkness. That's what God is saying it was like before He spoke into the darkness and created the light. Interesting enough, if you turn over to the beginning of the Gospel, in John chapter 1, verses 1 through 5, you see Matthew and Mark, they start with Jesus being born, and they start with His genealogy. I said Matthew, Mark, Matthew and Luke. Mark begins right when Jesus is baptized, but John takes it all the way back to the beginning. And his first 3 words are the same as Moses' first 3 words. In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God, and all things were made through Him, and without Him was not anything made that was made. In Him was life. In other words, Everything that is alive now is alive because of God, because of Jesus. He goes on to say in those verses, in him was life, and that life was the light of men, and the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Some translations say the darkness cannot comprehend it, which is another way of saying the darkness can't overcome a single point of light. And so Jesus is that light. If you turn to John chapter 3, verses 19 through 21, we're going to start in the 16th verse. It says, for God so loved the world. We all know that passage, don't we? He's speaking to Nicodemus here. Nicodemus comes to Jesus under cover of darkness. I don't know if there's a reason for that. Some people have tried to say, well, the Pharisees were against Jesus. That could be it. This is actually kind of towards the beginning of Jesus' ministry before the Pharisees start throwing a fit too much. So it may not be it either. It could just be that Nicodemus was busy. He works hard. He's a member of the Sanhedrin. He's a Pharisee. He has a lot of things to do through the day. This might be the only chance he had to get out and talk to Jesus was at nighttime. Or it could be he's coming under cover of darkness. Either way, darkness is present. And so Jesus says to him in John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. In the 17th verse, he says, for God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him. Now, he's leading up to this because in the 18th verse it says, whoever believes in him is not condemned, but whoever does not believe is condemned already because he has not believed in the name of the only Son of God. This is a callback to Deuteronomy chapter 18 when God told Moses that there would be another prophet that would arise like him. There were all kinds of different prophets that arose after Moses, but there was the capital P prophet that Deuteronomy 18 is talking about. In Deuteronomy 18, God says, and whoever doesn't listen to this prophet that's like you, Moses, will be cut off from the people. And so Jesus is saying here, those who believe will be saved. Those who do not believe will be condemned already because they have not believed in the only Son of God. Verse 19 says, and this is the judgment, that the light has come into the world, and people love the darkness rather than the light because their deeds were evil. For everyone who does wicked things hates the light and does not come into the light, lest his deeds should be exposed. Whoever does what is true comes to the light, so that it may be clearly seen that his deeds have been carried out in God. This also reminds me of something that Paul says over in Colossians, when he says that God has transferred us from the domain of darkness into the kingdom of his beloved Son. And of course that kingdom is the church. The domain of darkness is the kingdom of the world, the kingdom of darkness, the kingdom of Satan. But because God has come through Christ, and we have believed and we have obeyed, and he has transferred us out of that domain, out of that kingdom, that territory of darkness, and put us into the kingdom of his beloved Son, which, don't miss the contrast there. He doesn't say the kingdom of light, but the contrast is there. The church is the kingdom of light that is founded upon the light of the world, Jesus Christ. If you turn also with me to the book of John chapter 12, we're going to look at verses 35 through 36. Again, that's John chapter 12, verses 35 through 36, and then we're going to skip down to the 46th verse. Jesus says in this passage, let's see here, chapter 12, verse 35, Jesus said to them, the light is among you for a little longer. Jesus will be crucified soon. Walk while you have the light, lest darkness overtake you. The one who walks in the darkness does not know where he is going. While you have the light, believe in the light, that you may become sons of light. This also reminds us of something else in the book of James. It talks about God, the Father of heavenly lights. Now, yes, he did create the sun and the moon and the stars, so he's their Father. And that probably plays into it. But as Christians, we are invited, we're going to talk about that in a minute, to walk in the light, and to share in the light, and to be the light of the world. And so not only is God the Father of the heavenly lights, as they hang there in the heavens, giving light to us for the day, as the sun, as our star, the sun does, or even give light to us at nighttime, as the moon reflects the sun, and the faraway stars shine upon the earth. He's also the Father of you and I, who are the light of the world, as we'll see here in a minute as well. We are to shine in the darkness. God is the Father of the heavenly lights. We must walk in the light while we can and share the light with others. Because it was prophesied that Jesus, that the Son of God, the Messiah, would be a light to the nations. Turn with me, if you will, to Isaiah chapter 9. And we're going to look at verse 2. We're going to look at several passages in the book of Isaiah. We're going to start with Isaiah chapter 9 and verse 2. We've been in Isaiah 9 a couple of times, and in fact, that's where we started our study way back in January. We'll start in the first verse. It says, "But there will be gloom for her who was in anguish." Gloom is another way of saying darkness, but a heavy darkness, a sadness almost. There have been times in my life when someone that I was very close to became sick, and I knew that they weren't going to make it. Or someone that I was incredibly close to did pass away. And even though they were Christians, I knew that it would be a while probably before I saw them again. And so it felt as if a gloomy darkness was over my heart. You probably can relate to that as well. And it takes a while before that gloominess is lifted. And in some ways it may never completely be lifted. But it does get better after a while. And he says that there's gloom, so there's a heavy darkness for those who are in anguish. In the former time, he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. He's talking about Israel here being gloomy darkness. But in the latter time he was made glorious by the way of the sea, and the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. The people, not just Israelites, everybody, the people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Now, when we have that gloomy darkness over our hearts and over our minds because of something horrible, or something that just makes us completely sad, maybe even robs us of our sleep, that is one thing. But what he's talking about is a gloomy darkness that can't be lifted by anybody but God. The cost of sin. And so he says now that the people, the nations who walked in darkness, have now seen a great light. And those who dwelt in the land of deep darkness, on them the light has shined. That is speaking of none other than Jesus. If you turn over to Isaiah chapter 42 and verse 6, Isaiah in this passage says, "Everyone helps his neighbor and says to his brothers, be strong." That's what we do as the light. We help our neighbors. The light is now shining upon us, and we shine that light upon others. Let's go to another passage. That was Isaiah 41:6. I also want us to read Isaiah chapter 42 and verse 6. It says, "I am the Lord, and I have called you in righteousness." He's called us into the light, into righteousness. And he goes on to say in that passage, "I will give you as a covenant for the people, a light for the nations." Not just Israel. Everybody. And remember, if you were in class with us this morning, we went over Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. In that chapter, God calls Abraham, or Abram at that point, out of Ur. And he says to Abram, "I want you to go to a faraway land. I want you to go from Ur, which is in Iraq. I want you to go to Canaan," which of course we know is Israel at this point. He says, I'm going to give you a child in your old age." That wouldn't happen for almost another quarter of a century in Abraham's life, a long time. For us looking back, it wasn't long, but for Abraham, think back 25 years ago, if you've been alive for 25 years, and realize that's a pretty big chunk of our lives right there. Abraham would receive the first promise that God gave for almost 25 years, a quarter of a century. And he says, "I'm going to make you a father of many nations." He begins to see that before he dies, but the nation of promise would not come along for about 400 and some odd years before, until after he died. And he says, "And then through you, all the nations of the earth will be blessed." That's Jesus establishing the kingdom upon the earth. The light, the kingdom of light. And so God is reminding the people in Isaiah's time, there's coming a light. A covenant, not just for the people of Israel, but for all people everywhere. In Isaiah chapter 49 and verse 6. Again, it's Isaiah chapter 49 and verse 6. he says this concerning these things. We start in the 5th verse. And now the Lord says, He who formed me from the womb to be his servant, to bring Jacob back to him, and that Israel might be gathered to him. For I am honored in the eyes of the Lord, and my God has become my strength. He says, Is it too light a thing that you should be my servant, to raise up the tribes of Jacob, and to bring back the preserved of Israel? I will make you as a light for the nations, that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth. And so when we read about Jesus as being the light of the world, and we know that Isaiah, 700 and some odd years before Jesus was even born, making prophecies through the Holy Spirit concerning the fact that the darkness is here, but the light is coming. And now, 2,000 years removed from that side of Jesus coming and resurrecting and ascending into heaven, and he still sits at the right hand of God, interceding on our behalf, mediating on our behalf, for there is one mediator between man and God, the man Christ Jesus. You and I are now the light of the world as well. And though darkness is still upon us, we are able to fight back with the light that Christ has put in our hearts. In Matthew, or John, we're going to go back to John chapter 9 and verse 5. Sorry for the confusion there. John chapter 9 and verse 5. I want you to see here what is said by Jesus. He just says, he's already said in John 8:12, but this time he says, as long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. And then you turn over to Acts chapter 26, 18 through 23. Again, that's Acts chapter 26, verses 18 through 23. In this passage, as we're getting close to the end of the book of Acts, again, Paul is quoting Jesus, he has quoted Jesus, Acts 26, 18 and 23. He says to open their eyes. Start in verse, let's go ahead and start in verse 16, or start in verse 15. And Paul is rehearsing or going over what had happened to him when Jesus confronted him on the road to Damascus. It's interesting when you think about it, because when Paul sees Jesus, what does he see? A bright light. And it's so bright that it causes Paul to go blind for a few days, until later on something like scales fall off of his eyes. And later on through the New Testament, Paul talks about how he has trouble with his eyes. The light blinded him. Paul, who was already in darkness, now has to see the light become truly blind in darkness in order for him to know what it is to be the light of the world. And so now he says, when he's rehashing this, he says, I am Jesus. He's saying, this is what Jesus said to me. I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. You remember God said to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, those who bless you I will bless, and those who curse you I will curse. In other words, God is going to take care of His people. Those that are blessed under the covenant of Abraham, which continues even today, the covenant that God had given Abraham, the promise, we are still beneficiaries of. Whenever we are baptized, whenever another person is baptized in the waters, they are being connected to that promise. God said, I'm going to protect my people. And so Paul says, who are you? And Jesus says, I'm Jesus, whom you are persecuting. Well, Jesus had been crucified and resurrected and ascended for years before this, several years before this. How was he persecuting him? Because he was persecuting God's people. God takes it personally. He protects his people. And he goes on to say, and Jesus went on to say to Paul, rise and stand up on your feet, for I have appeared to you for this purpose, to appoint you as a servant and witness to the things of which you have seen me and to those in which I will appear to you, delivering you from your people and from the Gentiles to whom I am sending you, to open their eyes, so that they may turn from darkness to light, and from the power of Satan to God. All of these things start to take place and take shape, so that they may receive forgiveness of sins at a place among those who are sanctified by faith in me. In the 23rd verse, Paul says that the Christ might suffer that, and must suffer, and that by being the first born from the dead, first to rise from the dead rather, He would proclaim light both to our people and to the Gentiles. Darkness is over the world, sin and death. Jesus has defeated them both, and He is the light. And in Him, sin is melted away. And in Him, death is defeated. And now we have been called into the light as well, to be the light. In fact, we've been invited by this. If you turn over to Daniel chapter 12, we're going to read verses 2 through 9. Daniel gives a prophecy, it appears, concerning the resurrection, whether it be the spiritual resurrection of people that had been in darkness, but now are in the kingdom of light. Or maybe it even points for the coming of the second coming of Christ in the general resurrection. It could be on both levels. He says in Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, "And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever." Again, that reminds us of what James says about God, the Father of the heavenly lights. He goes on to say in verse 4, "But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase." He's talking about the time of the end, the last days, which we've been in for a couple thousand years. We've arisen in one way, as we read about in Romans chapter 6, from a life of sin to a life of righteousness. And it is our obligation to live in the light and be the light. In fact, that's what Jesus says in Matthew 5:14. "You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do people light a lamp and hide it under a bushel, but rather put it on a stand that it may give light to all that are in the house." You and I are the lights of the world because of the light of the world that was Jesus Christ. If you turn to Ephesians chapter 5, verses 8 through 14, I believe it is. Ephesians chapter 5, verses 8 through 14. Notice again what Paul says, and we are invited to take part in being the light, to share the light. He says, "For at one time," talking to the Ephesians, but it goes to everybody, "you were in darkness, but now you are the light in the world." In fact, he says, "You were darkness." Not you were in darkness, you were darkness. "But now you are the light that is in the world. Walk as children of light, for the fruit of light is found in all that is good and right and true. And try to discern what is pleasing to the Lord. Take no part in unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. For it is shameful even to speak the things that they do in secret. When anything is exposed by the light, it becomes visible. For anything that becomes visible is light. Therefore, it says, Awake, O sleeper, and arise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you." Don't go back to the darkness. You were darkness before we became Christians. Before we became the children of God, we were darkness. But now we are the light. And we must walk as children of light. And as John says in 1 John chapter 1, verses 5 through 7, this is the message, he says, that we have heard from Him and proclaimed to you, that God is light, and in Him there is no darkness at all. If we say we have fellowship with Him while we walk in darkness, we lie and do not practice the truth. But if we walk in the light, as He is in the light, we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of Jesus, His Son, cleanses us from all sin. Walk in the light as He is in the light. Don't walk in the darkness. We have no fellowship with God if we're in the darkness. Don't be the dark. Be the light. Jesus is the light of the world. I am the light of the world, and He invites us to take part in that light and to shine it through the darkness, to expose sin for what it really is, and to show that there is a way that we can not only be saved from sin, but that we can also have eternal life. Jesus, the light of the world. God with us. Today, if you need to respond to His invitation to come into the light, we encourage you to do so. Be transferred from the domain of darkness today and into the kingdom of His beloved Son. Resurrect today from the death of sin and become a child of God, baptized, die to your sin, and resurrect a new creature, as Paul talks about in Romans 6. Go on your way rejoicing, shining the light of Jesus wherever you go. If you need to respond to the Lord's invitation today, we encourage you that now, while together we stand.